Hey, good morning everybody, and welcome to the latest in our series of Breakfast for Teaching and Learning in 2016. Fantastic to see you all here and online, and we're very lucky this morning to have Professor Sue Bennett with us from the School of Education at the University of Wollongong. And she's come over to Adelaide to speak to us, so we're very lucky to have her on campus with us. She's going to speak to us about design thinking for teaching in higher education. So before we get started, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. I'd like to acknowledge that this meeting is being held on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people, and we pay our respect to elders both past and present. So over to Sue, and just a little bit of housekeeping. If you're online, if you could post any questions you have throughout the talk, but we'll get to those in the last 10 minutes or so. Okay, thanks very much.
Great, thank you, Stuart. I just wanted to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here in person. Anybody who knows me will know that I'm not a morning person, so they might be surprised that I'm doing a seminar at 8, but I think I'm doing pretty well. And I've had bronchitis for the last week, so I do apologise if during the presentation I break out in some coughing. I hope it's not too annoying. Anyway, on to the presentation. So I'm here today to talk to you about design thinking for teaching in higher education. And I just want to start by making a sort of clarification. So I'm really talking about how design thinking can help us as teachers rather than design thinking for our students. So there's a big trend at the moment talking about design thinking as we might include it in our pedagogy, but really I'm talking about how it can help us in what we do as teachers. So it'll all be a bit clearer as I go on. So, and the problem, but, oh, and the computer's having. Here we go, it's woken up now. Okay, I'll use the mouse. That's okay. One thing less to hold in my hand. Okay, so I want to do 3 things today in this presentation. Is first of all talk to you about conceptualizing teaching as design. So how is teaching a form of design? Why might this be a useful way of thinking about design, thinking about teaching, and then how it's particularly relevant in higher education. Then I want to talk about some of the research on design thinking in higher education and implications for it, practical implications for a design thinking approach. Okay, so this idea of thinking about conceptualizing teaching as design is not really a new one. It's one that sort of recently emerged, and it's been particularly argued by people like Diana Laurillard and Peter Goodyear. And so if we're starting off to thinking about how is teaching a form of design, I've just put up on the screen 4 characteristics of design. So these are characteristics of any kind of design activity that come from the design studies literature. So design is about creating a solution to a complex problem. It's about humans in context. It's about a process of mutual adjustment where you come to know the problem better, the specifications of the problem, you further create and develop the proposed solution, and solutions draw on precedent and experience. So those characteristics are characteristics that all kinds of design activities have, whether it be architectural, engineering, or industrial design. When you think about it too, there are also characteristics of teaching as well. So given that there are some general characteristics, there are also some particular features of teacher design. So if we're going to conceptualize teaching as design, how is that then relevant particularly to higher education? So design in higher education is a routine part of teaching, and it's a part of teaching that's relatively neglected. So if we think about the kinds of research that have been done in the past on teaching in higher education, they relate a lot to the more performative aspects. So these kind of things, getting up and teaching to students. So I'm thinking about, the tips for lectures, how to give better lectures, how to structure lectures so they're more engaging, how to do tutorials, how to do practical or demonstrations. So, so design and planning have always been a part of it, but it's not something that research has focused on in the past. So this kind of movement to conceptualise teaching as design is to try to foreground some of that. So it's relevant also because improving design has got flow-on benefits for learners. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but Prosser and Trigwell have got this chain of relations between teachers' conceptions of teaching through to their approaches, which influence students' approaches to learning, which influences their activities and outcomes. So if you just put design in that as well, so design is part of a teacher's approach to learning. So there sort of stands to reason, there's this logical argument that we can, if we can improve the design of our teaching, not just the teaching we do as performance, but all of the design, then this will have later flow-on benefits to students. And in addition, so design is also increasingly important in the context of contemporary higher education. Now to sort of illustrate this, I'm going to, and that just moved on. Oh, okay. I'm thinking, wow, am I moving that on with my mind? Which I thought, wow, this is an advanced classroom, but maybe not that advanced. Okay, so what I've done here is borrowed a diagram from one of Peter Goodyear's papers. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but if you haven't read it, it's worth reading. So it's a review paper that Peter did for HERDSA. And in it, I think this diagram encapsulates some of the forces at play in contemporary higher education. So we know we're getting a more diverse student population coming through. They've got more varied requirements and needs. There's rising expectations about the graduates we produce. So there's societal expectations as well as employer expectations. So there's a greater emphasis on the quality of teaching in higher education, more so than there ever has been. I'm sure all of us can empathise with the intensifying pressures on staff. You know, workloads are not only heavier, but they're more diverse. There are more things that we have to do. There's accelerating technological change. I think this room is a good example, but you know, there's sort of this inexorable development of technology that we all need to keep on top of as regular teachers. And if you put that into a sort of context where traditional teaching practices are under pressure and there's accelerating research about what successful learning is. So if you just, in your mind just for a moment, just put all of those things together as drivers of change in higher education, we're faced with a pretty complex phenomenon. We're in a complex environment where we're sort of wondering, I think we're sort of wondering what can our strategies be. So one of the things that Peter says out of this, and I think he puts this really well, which a number of us have been thinking pretty heavily about. So I've just chosen that quote there. So this situation means making universities more design savvy. Now, that can't mean just bringing in more expert designers, instructional designers, educational designers to help us, even though that is a very, very important source of support in higher education. It actually means everyone in the whole institution becoming more design savvy so that there can be knowledgeable design-led change. Okay, so really this is, I think, the challenge that Peter is putting to us, that in that complex environment, if we're serious about high quality education, then all of us, every single one of us from the top down, need to understand what their role is in creating a design savvy university. Now this is a really significant challenge, I think. Okay, so there are the reasons why we should think that design thinking is relevant to higher education. We've got this complex environment. Teachers already do some of this stuff already, so it's part of the job description, although it's hidden. And we've got this knowledge about design already. So what I want to do now is say, okay, well, if that's the situation, what do we know already about how teachers design in higher education? Hi. saw it come in. Okay, so there's been a whole lot of research and development around, I think, under this umbrella term, learning design, and probably many of you will be familiar with some of this. This sort of work actually emerged from educational technology, and it started out from a discussion about sharing and reusability. So it actually sort of started around learning objects, which is now getting on to about 15 years ago. And after, I guess, a bit of dissatisfaction with learning objects, people thought, well, maybe it's not resources that we need to be reusable. We need designs, pedagogical designs that we can reuse. So a number of people started working in this area. So I've been working in this area a lot with my colleagues, but there's a whole lot of related work. So there's work on what's called pedagogical patterns. So this is, again, borrowed from a design discipline of architecture, that there can be these patterns that we can adapt and we can reuse in our own context. There's a range of other representations that people have used. So representation has been a big part of this area of research. There have been a whole lot of tools developed. So one, particularly well-known one is a tool called Learning Designer that Diana Laurelard's developed. And there have been standards. So if you think the technical standards that underlie the interoperability of these tools, particularly our colleagues in the Netherlands have done a lot of work on that. So there's been a lot of work in this area, and I would say, and I don't think any of my colleagues would disagree with me, that a lot of this has been development work rather than research. So one of the challenges with development work is we're often presupposing a lot of things about the context, and that's the basis for our action. So I guess the thing that I'm saying is, I think in this sense, in this context, we've intervened before we really understand what we're intervening in. And that is probably the reason why a lot of these tools have not been widely taken up by the end users, which is really our everyday higher education teachers. Okay, so what we're left with is still we have fundamental questions about teacher design and how best to support it, because we don't really understand a lot of what teachers are doing naturally. Okay, so I've been doing some work on this with my colleagues at the University of Wollongong and UTS, and I just want to give you a summary of some of the work we've found, because we've done one of the few studies where we actually try to find out what teachers' practice actually is. Okay, so down the bottom of each of these first two screens is also a paper that you can go to if you're interested in reading more about this. So this comes from a study of 30 Australian university teachers who we talked to, quite at length. They're across a whole range of different institutions and different discipline areas. We asked them the same series of questions, which is really about how they do their design work. So we came up with 3 different sets of findings. So the first one is about the kind of process they use. So some of this will make a whole lot of sense to you because it's probably what you've experienced, but it's interesting that there's been little empirical work to characterise this. So university teachers really use 2 processes, design and redesign. So design is where you design something from scratch, and redesign is sort of that continuous thing you do every year to update. And so we were able to characterise these as 2 different processes where you follow slightly different steps. Depending on what you're doing, you might start with content and outcomes, content or outcomes. But regardless of where you start, you always sort of go to the other one straight away. So I suppose one of the things that we were trying to do is explore how many people start out with thinking about, well, this subject's got to cover this content, and how many think about these are the outcomes that I need to address. And so what we were discovering is that even across the disciplines, we couldn't really see a difference in this. So we couldn't say, okay, all science people start here and all humanities people start here. It's a bit of a mix, but regardless of where you start, you quickly move on to the other. So rather than see it as you must start with outcomes, which is actually something that we're told all the time, and look, it's fair enough that people are going to start with content, but it's okay because they move on to outcomes and the 2 become very quickly entwined. So I think that was a kind of a good news story. The way that most people work is they go from broad to specific. So they start off with a kind of broad skeleton or outline or framework for their unit, and then they move down to designing specific things. And often that means they defer the design for some things. So they might only design the first 6 weeks of tutorials, but they sort of know what they're doing and they'll design it as it goes along. But they've got the overarching structure. And what happens with design is it's iterative and continuous. So you're iteratively designing, so you might start with your broad approach and then dip into the middle and then come back to the beginning, and you just work around and around that cycle. And it's continuous in that it doesn't stop at the beginning of semester. So you're doing more design work during the semester within the framework that you've set up. So those things are important, and I'll get back to it draw this all together in a minute. But those are the kind of characteristics of the processes that university teachers use when they're designing. Now, influences. So we had 4 themes in terms of the kind of influences people talked about. Their own past experience was really important. So what they'd done before, what they'd found successful, what they'd found not successful. They were really motivated by meeting students' needs, and so they had quite sophisticated ideas about their cohorts, particularly if they've been teaching a unit for a long time. So they're anticipating students' needs, they're thinking ahead because they've got ideas about who their students are and what they need, down to who the subsets of students are in a subject. So they'd be talking about, well, who this subject is for. Often they wanted to try something new. That was an influence on their design. I want to try something out. I want to experiment a little bit. And always they're working within the constraints. So all of those things are true, but they're still talking about, I've got this type of room that I've booked for this subject, or I'm stuck with this kind of timetabling. Down to, well, I've only got these sets of resources. So those are all of the things that are coming in to influence what university teachers are doing when they're designing. And in terms of resources, this was a really interesting one, and this is where there's, possibly something that's a bit kind of controversial for any of us who've worked in central units before, and I'm one of those people. I started out as an instructional designer and became a regular teaching and research academic. I think this point here in the middle, that most university teachers we spoke to felt that there was limited help they could get from central units. They talked about how it was maybe helpful in the beginning of their careers, but as they started to get more experience, they wanted a different kind of assistance. And I think that poses a bit of a challenge for us. Interestingly, there were hugely varied sources of inspiration, from the colleague down the corridor to something that they saw on TV or a discussion at a dinner party, which makes you think that some of us are really nerdy if we're getting ideas from a discussion at a dinner party. Importantly, most of the things that university teachers really valued were discipline specific. So that doesn't mean that you can't get ideas from something that's more general, but they related to things that were in their discipline more easily, and that they valued near colleagues. And I think this is a really important point because it's the credible other. So that actually might be somebody that they know through their professional network from a conference or a discipline network. It might be someone just down the corridor. It could be someone in a central unit. But that importance of their own sort of network of these near colleagues. And I put near in inverted commas because there could be thousands of kilometres away. Okay, so what can we make of these particular findings in terms of the kind of idea that I'm trying to present today? So many of those activities are consistent with previous research from design studies in other fields of design. So remember before when I said that idea of designing from broad to specific? That's a very consistent practice across all forms of design. The idea of precedent, so I mentioned that earlier. So the idea of past experience coming in here, near colleagues, those are all very consistent with what other types of designers do. So I think this is an interesting one because what we've done is we've taken these findings and tried to say, well, how is this like design as we would recognise it from other fields? And there's quite a strong level of consistency there. So this is really interesting because, as I said at the beginning, we don't usually think about teaching work as design. the whole idea of conceptualizing teaching as design is a fairly new idea and one that's not particularly mainstream. Okay, so now we're in this situation where there are teachers who do design-like work, but we don't recognise it. So there's a sort of invisibility to that design work. And it's partly because if you think about how you design and prepare, often you're going away and you're doing it in your office in the spare time you can find, or a lot of time people are working at home to get their design work done. So it's not stuff we actually see. Unlike this stuff, the performative stuff is stuff we see people doing. It's on people's timetables, on their doors. So we know that they're doing that kind of stuff. And so really it's interesting to think about, you know, perhaps what we've got here is a group of accidental designers. So they're sort of designers that they don't know it and we don't know it and nobody sees it. And so what's developed is a sort of design practice, but it's more of a folk practice. So it's not an established professional practice, but it's kind of grown up out of the culture that we've had. So there is sharing of experience, and so that is an important part, and that's a very important part of design work. Think about really what architecture magazines do. That's a sharing of design. So designers share design. We share experience, but it's pretty ad hoc. So when people were talking about where they get their ideas from, they didn't really have a particular process for doing it. A lot of people did go to the literature. They were looking for papers and case studies. They were hearing about college designs, maybe at a conference. But again, it's really an ad hoc kind of activity and not part of a kind of a practice that they'd taken on, although they knew that it was really important. And so just in closing about that particular study, that is the beginning of us finding out about design practice. So one of the limitations was the sample. So we recruited people through professional organisations, HERDSA, Ascolite, AARE. So a lot of these people who were working in disciplines are already switched on to teaching. So our kind of, I suppose our disclaimer would be, some of these people are already really highly motivated to teach and to learn more about teaching. So that actually means there's a whole set of people who are perhaps not as interested, and we know less about how they design from this study. And also our approach was to talk to people. Mind you, it was sometimes a long conversation. It was sometimes a 90-minute conversation about their design practice, but we didn't observe them. So we haven't followed through that process. So that's just kind of to put that in context, and it's to sort of reinforce the point that now we know a little tiny bit, but there's still so much more we need to know. So there are some, one of my PhD students recently finished a study where she actually followed people in a more ethnographic way through a bit more than a semester of design. And she found out some more interesting things to add to that knowledge base. But we still need more and more studies like this, where we're actually finding out about how teachers work as designers. And in other fields, this is the kind of mainstay of a whole lot of their research. So they actually go and investigate how design teams work. So there's a lot more to be done in this particular kind of space. Okay, so what are the implications for supporting design? So what do these results have for kind of practical implications? So I think first of all, we need to acknowledge that there is a practice, and that it is that we're trying to understand that and develop that further. Some of the approaches taken so far have just seen university teachers as sort of a blank slate, that I can come in and take you through a workshop process, I can get you to use a tool, but it doesn't tap into any of the practices that you already have. Now, some people would argue that those practices are so underdeveloped we can just ignore them and we can come in with the way design should be done. But I would argue actually the opposite, is that if you want to get take up of an idea, if you want people to think about design and become, I suppose, more design savvy, you need to start where they are. And these practices already exist. We can't really wish them away. And some of them are consistent with good design practice, so they're the things to build on and strengthen and go further with. Another thing that we need is sort of appropriate design models and tools. Now, no architect would work without a representation of their design. Engineers have got modelling tools. So even in just the capacity to represent your design in a kind of external form, to document and record it, enables a couple of really important things. So first of all, it helps your thinking. It makes your thinking concrete, and then you can look at that and you can critique it. It also makes it shareable. So it enables you to work between teams, amongst teams. So there's been some work done on this already with representation. And people who've used representations have found them really helpful in their design process. We need to do more of that and look at how those representations work. And it doesn't mean there's going to be one representation. There could be many, but that we need to understand what are the characteristics of a really useful representation. So those are some of the kinds of tools, but there's also this idea of a design model. Now, research on instructional designers has shown that the way an experienced instructional designer works is that they don't follow a model like Merrill's model or, ADDIE. They have in their heads a heuristic. So they have developed sort of their own practice model, process model of how you get from the initial problem to the solution. So that requires a number of things. That requires a language to discuss design. It requires, recognizing that there are particular processes that are more effective than others. And that's the kind of thing that we could be developing for teachers. So importantly, teaching as design has a whole range of different characteristics to other kinds of design. So I'm not advocating for a moment, and I'm actually dead against importing instructional design models for university teachers. I don't think they're going to work. I can say that I actually tried it 15 years ago, so it doesn't work. Because those models aren't sensitive to the kinds of roles and the nature of a teacher's work. So we need some models that are customised and suited to us. So as part of that, so making the case that there's already a practice and that we can develop tools that can support that practice and develop it further. Identifying strategies that sort of build teaching repertoire. So I guess it's going back to this idea that it's not that teachers need to be fixed. It's not that that would be a deficit view. It's that what we could be doing is seeking to build their repertoire of skills in teaching and learning. And an approach like that is going to be more valued than an approach that just comes in and says, okay, you've been doing it wrong, just do it like this. Okay, so what would a teacher design thinking approach look like? So this is where I kind of try to get out of my kind of researcher space where I say it's all messy and complicated and there's lots of stuff we don't know. So this is a bit of my own leap to thinking, well, if we were going to take up Peter's design challenge to make universities more design savvy, what would that actually mean? Okay, so first of all, I think fundamentally it has to be teacher-led and problem-driven and collegial. So really what I'm saying is it needs to be bottom-up. It can't just be top-down. I've seen lots of situations before where somebody high up in teaching and learning has said, okay, this is the model we're going to use and this is how we're going to use it. And those kind of things are, I'll say it politely, unhelpful. To get buy-in from the people who need to benefit from this, it needs to be led by them. And it needs to be based around the kind of problems that teachers experience all the time. We need an evidence base of shareable design knowledge. So kind of the basis of all of that kind of jargon is really we need a way to share our practice, to share good practice, and to share strategies that are based on research evidence. Now, when we report our research in teaching and learning, it doesn't always kind of pop out as readily usable strategies. So this is sort of a research translation exercise, if you like. It's going that next step to say, okay, well, here are the results of this set of studies. Maybe it's about student self-regulated learning. Now, how do we then translate that into designs for our students? But developing this kind of design knowledge, again, it's something, this is what design disciplines do already. So if we're going to become design savvy, we're going to need this to draw on. Underpinned by design process models for the exact reasons that I just mentioned before. Design process models are those things that help us understand how we get from A to B. We already have some of that, but I don't think we've got any language around it. We don't have ways of sharing, well, this is actually how I do my design. It's some kind of dark art that occurs in your office or, you know, at home on your computer, probably directly in the learning management system. We need to acknowledge that design's iterative, future-oriented and developmental. And I think this is important because this sort of goes to the way we organise ourselves. There are increasingly limited opportunities for a teaching staff member to take a unit and see it through multiple iterations over years. So that kind of used to be the way we did it. I had my subject and I taught it and I developed it over the course of a few years. And that enabled me to do a couple of things. I could defer design work to the next cohort. So I could say something like, okay, I want to implement problem-based learning, but I don't have time or the resources to go the whole hog and I'm going to do this bit. And then next year I'll do this and next year I'll do this bit. So in the kind of era of increasing casualisation, increasing atomization, that it makes that more difficult to occur. So we sort of need to think through our processes to really enable this kind of strategy to work really well. But if you think about how designers work, they're thinking in a cycle. So everything that we do to interrupt that cycle in terms of how we organise ourselves makes it more difficult. Sometimes even in teaching teams, we make it more difficult to be design oriented because we don't often factor in the time for teams to meet, to design together. The design is done by somebody, handed down to other people and often not discussed. And then sometimes if the marking is done by somebody else, some of that vital information about how students are actually working never comes back to the person who designs the subject. All of these things make it more difficult to be design savvy. And we need to integrate technologies as supports for teaching and learning. Like that's a bit of a no-brainer. And I sort of didn't really stick it in there just to make sure that we talked about technology today. But if we were taking a more design-oriented approach, I think that we would think about how we integrate technology a bit differently. So I've got some really fantastic colleagues who are kind of taking the call to arms to integrate technology innovatively, really seriously. But I can still know that it feels to them like it's an add-on. It's not really integrated and part of what they're doing. And it's because some of that technologies are moving feast. It's difficult to keep up with. Things change every time you go into a teaching room. The technology is different. Sometimes it feels a bit like that. A design, that kind of more iterative developmental approach might actually enable us to integrate technology in a more sustainable and kind of human-friendly way. That's just a thought. Okay, and if we were to take a design savvy approach, it sort of opens up some opportunities for student co-design. Now, I think this is becoming something that's being increasingly talked about. But just a little aside, I know this is being recorded, but that's okay. I was talking about this to some colleagues the other day, and I could see that my ADE was sitting in the front row, and when I did that, she just went, and I think she was thinking about all of the headaches and the hard work it was going to be in terms of paperwork to have students co-design, because we've got to set these designs down in concrete and they become sort of like a quasi-legal contract. So if we were going to open space for students to design with us, we would have to treat that differently. So I think there's some open questions about how we might invite students into our design practice if we were going to be more design savvy. But there are a lot of interesting ideas that we could take up if we had a more design thinking approach. Okay, all of that sounds great, but I think it would take an extremely brave Vice-Chancellor, Deputy Vice-Chancellor to kind of take this on. So this would be a really significant change in resources and processes within institutions. Just from those few examples I gave you, it would mean changing quite a lot. So I'm kind of not, I guess I'm going to say I'm kind of not that hopeful that we're going to become design savvy in a hurry. Except that I would say that I'll go back to that idea that some of this needs to be led from the grassroots. I think some of those design thinking ideas are something that any group of people could take on themselves. So as individuals, they could kind of pursue some of this thinking to support themselves in their own practice, but also maybe as a team or a small group. So maybe that's where some of the change is going to come from, and then the administration will catch up. And that's the end of what I had to say. So I'm going to open it for questions and comments. So we've got heaps of time now for questions and comments.
Okay, thanks very much, Sue. I've asked people online to post their questions, and I'm sure a few will come in. Do we have any questions in the room to begin with? We have one over here.
Not quite so much a question as a ramble, thinking aloud.
Yeah, those are welcome.
Thanks for your talk. The kind of lens of design or design thinking that you bring to thinking about teaching practice, as you've said, it highlights, it gives people some shared language, some tools to think about and develop to practice, makes some aspects visible of teaching that weren't visible before, those kinds of things. Looking at those points though, it kind of parallels earlier discussions around ideas of the importance of scholarship and scholarship of teaching and learning, and kind of other lenses of, related lenses of scholarship, teaching as a research, teaching as practice, I guess, and research, a practice-based research. It's kind of interesting parallels, and I'm kind of wondering how they speak, whether they need to speak to each other more directly, perhaps.
I think that's a really good point, and I think they could certainly speak to each other more directly, because that scholarship of teaching and learning is what's going to help us build up that evidence-based, shareable design knowledge. So I think that would be a great place to start. And in our study, when we were talking to people about the kind of literature that they were using, that was more the literature that they were drawing on, scholarship of teaching and learning. Now, you know, I think scholarship of teaching and learning has, it's not valued, I think, as much as it could be or should be, and maybe that's also because some of that work and some of the way that it's written is, you know, maybe not as rigorous as it could be. So I'll put it like that. I think we're still searching around to find out what scholarship of teaching and learning can be and what it can offer. But certainly, I think that the conversation can be had between the idea of design, shareable design knowledge and knowledge that you derive from scholarship of teaching and learning. No, I think that's good. I'm going to think about it more. But I think it's partly in the same space, and you find many of the same people talking about that. So, and it does have many of the same ambitions, if you like. And I suppose what the design thinking approach offers is, okay, well, if we have that knowledge, what are we going to do with it? How would we enact it in perhaps a more deliberate way? And that's what the design process and those kind of models would offer us.
Thanks. So there's a question from online. Is there a space that may lend itself more to design work to progress? Jane, is that you?
Okay.
You want to clarify? So I actually had two questions. So I'll take the latter one because that was the last part of your talk. Okay, yeah. So I was just wondering then, when you were saying, look, are we actually going to get there because of the stalling of the processes of administration and so on, and the policy aspects that we deal with? is there something that you would see as a first step that would enable that pathway to come through a little bit more clearer? So is there sort of a good indication for you that maybe it could be an example of an institution in another country, or it might be just a particular discipline that lends itself more to this process that you can point to as an example for other disciplines to pick up or other universities to pick up?
Well, I think I'm going to say I haven't really seen a good example of this. I've seen examples of efforts to do this. So I suppose I'd probably reflect more on how we could not do it or why some of those things haven't worked very well. So I'll give an example from my own institution because, you know, that feels a bit more appropriate. So a while back, actually it's probably about 10 years ago now, we started part of it was on our website, sort of case studies or cases of, you know, effective integration of technology, something like that. And various people in the university were asked to contribute to it. And there were some quite nice, I think, well-described cases about how you might go about doing some things. And it wasn't taken up. And I think the reason why it wasn't taken up is it kind of got sandwiched in the middle layer of, it was an initiative of somebody in one of our central units, one of our educational designers, who neither really had, I think, enough support from above and then couldn't garner support from below, if you like. Sorry to use a kind of crude hierarchy, but I'm sure we all feel like we're somewhere in that food chain. And I think that it was probably too early. It was a great idea, but maybe too soon. I think it sort of indicates how carefully you sort of need to cultivate the groundwork for this. And it had no real focus. So I'm going to suggest that one of the strategies that might be better is to find maybe a school or a department that's willing to get on board and maybe a project to focus something like this around so that you can develop that and then that becomes a transferable practice to elsewhere. So while there's activity happening on the ground, it also has tiers of support above it. So it's a supported, recognised activity, so you can have the DVCA saying, I think this is a really important thing to do and here are the people in our own institution doing it and my ambition is for all of us to be able to do this. I haven't seen anywhere where that's happened. In terms of some other parts of the puzzle, this kind of instinct I think that we have to share and to access other people's expertise, that has, I think, led to some really fantastic initiatives like Gráinne Knoll's Cloudworks. So that was, for everybody who might not be familiar with that, yeah, that was an online community where people could share any kind of idea about teaching and learning. So it could be, you know, as big as a case study, it could be just a snippet of an idea, it could even be posing a question, and then use sort of social media strategies to tag and to search, and people had profiles. Yeah, and like a lot of things, it took off and became really successful, and then it kind of got really messy and hard to follow. So there's a bunch of those things where, you know, people have had a sort of initiative to start something and it's shown a lot of promise, and sometimes it's been taken up institutionally for smaller activities. But then, you know, for various reasons, it hasn't continued. So we've sort of, I think, got pockets of knowledge about how things can be successful, but we're yet to put it together, and I think that's Peter's point as well, is that to do this, there's some knowledge that we have to bring together, and there's some other knowledge that we have to deliberately go and try to get that we don't have. So, you know, we might even be too soon for, you know, my list of kind of ideas of here's what I think would need to happen. We probably don't even have the foundation for all of those, but we sort of, you know, we sort of have an opportunity to take up this challenge that has been put out there, a very real challenge, and you know, it'll take some pretty brave thinking to think about how you do it as an institution.
Thanks. Any more questions in the room? Okay, just.
Oh, got a mic. Oh, it might not come through. So I read about some institutions who were gathering groups of staff together from a program or degree, pretty much locking them away for a while, bringing instructional designers in, academic developers in, multimedia experts. So it's an assembly of a whole team and kind of bunkering them down for maybe 2 weeks or maybe even longer. And they absolutely smashed the design out. Lots of sticky notes on walls like this. Then they go back and they do some
Well, I
building
mean,
and then they
that's a
reconvene.
really design thinking approach. So that's one of the characteristics of design that I didn't talk about, which is in real world design projects, we bring together people with differing expertise to work together. So it's not necessarily, and this is something I didn't cover, but something that came out of our research is that for most university teachers, design is a solo activity. So you might get together with your people in your program and work out where your unit fits, but then as unit coordinator, you're the one responsible to go back and design it. So that's another kind of structural way we work, and often that's to do with resources. So to me, that sounds like a fantastic approach. And that would mean that we would need to build in design time, that we would need to create design schedules where we can bring people together, not, end the year in a bit of a heap in December, have your holiday and come back and think, oh right, now what am I teaching in semester 1? Like that's what I mean. It takes a very deliberate, different approach. And that's probably, in our university, that resourcing would happen at school level. So that takes the head of school to say, we're going to do it like this. So this last year, for the very first time that I've been in my long period of time at the University of Wollongong, my 18 years there, we finally got design time put into our workload model. This is kind of, so we're still struggling to even recognise that design happens. So, I mean, I think a model like that is fantastic. And then what you would need to build in is the iteration. So what happens next time it's offered? So that's the design thinking approach, is that it's the unit that gets designed, that next time there's a team that comes together, and you'd have to, the way we sort of do course design is we have, we have redesigns once every 5 years. Well, in the design savvy university, well, we can't be doing that because, first of all, we know it doesn't really happen like that in practice because teachers are doing lots of redesign every year, not just changing dates on subject outlines, doing lots more than that. But in 5 years' time, well, that's too slow. The world has moved on in 5 years' time. So there are these things, these ways of thinking in the industrial traditional university that don't fit a design-savvy institution. But the deployment of resources and how you think about that, well, a switched-on head of school could start doing some of that.
And yeah, you mentioned the central unit and the role of the central unit there, and how you feel it should be a teacher-led process. I wonder what you think the strategy for central units should be to sort of get that process rolling and to be part of that process.
Yeah, I think that's really tricky because, as I said, my background is I started working as an instructional designer, so I have an enormous fondness for central units and a sort of unwillingness to just bash them with being the source of all of the problems that we've got. I think there is a real challenge. But I think that part of it is working on those connections, and something that never happened when I was an instructional designer is, I guess I never had the idea that what I was doing with a staff member was developmental. I felt like I came in, I swooped in, and I had this thing we needed to do, and it might have been, I don't know, we're talking back in the day, so sending out some floppy disks to students or doing a teletutorial. But I sort of came in at a point and we worked, and then I left and I had no more engagement. So that's not even really a design thinking way of thinking about it. I didn't have the idea that I was building that particular academic's repertoire of skills. So we didn't have a release. So I think it could be, the key to it, so I'm coming to it in a more lucid way, is about maybe changing the contract. So changing that relationship to, I'm not coming in here to just help you do this thing for this subject unit. I'm coming in here to help you develop a particular skill that you're then going to take off with. Now, some of that might have happened, and I think that can happen if you've got a really good relationship with somebody. But I don't think it's been an explicit part of the bargain. I think that maybe that's been the way academic development has worked, but maybe not the way design support has worked. And that goes back to a few slides ago where I said that a strategy has to be about building capacity, because then you've got to be able to then hand over the design reins and then move on to somebody else, because there are lots and lots of academics, and there are never going to be enough central staff people to support. And that was Peter's point, is that the solution is not simply employing more design specialists. That's part of the solution, because we do need to build that specialist expertise. It's a particular thing that we need to build and value, but it's not scalable. That's not scalable when you consider how large and diverse our staff are.
Thanks very much, sir. If there's no more questions, we'll give our thanks to you, and we'll say goodbye to everybody online. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, and right on time. Oh. Shouldn't have. Very glad you did.
Well, when you come to South Australia, you need to get some South Australian wine.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Lovely.
Okay, thanks everybody. We have one more teaching and learning breakfast this year. Keep your eyes on the staff announcements and our email. We'll be speaking to some colleagues from the University of Canberra who'll be talking about blended learning in a design studio space. So that will be the last one in mid-November. So keep your eyes open for that one. And thanks for coming today, and we'll see you all soon.